All right. What are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to continue our discussion on the descent of Jesus, the place in the Apostles' Creed where it says Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried. And it goes on to say this very interesting phrase, he descended to the death. Or, even more interesting, I think, he descended to hell. What does that mean? How is it that Jesus goes to hell? Isn't that a little absurd? Yes. Ooh, there's a raven with a little thing on his cut on his foot. That was awkward. Uh, yes, it is exactly absurd to say Jesus went to hell, but I think that's the very exact message we're supposed to get, the absurdity of it. Even though we know the story of the cross, there's still this attempt to tame it, to not let it be as scandalous, to help it be put on a mantle and made holy and very religious. And we want to get away from the earthiness of it because we want to protect God. And that's the very message of what God is trying to tell us. He doesn't need our protection. In fact, He's lets Himself experience the depths of pain and frustration. And the question that sparked a huge shift in theology after World War II was one that some theologians really couldn't get their hands around. The idea of, if there is a God, and if God is good, and God is loving, and God is all powerful, how do we explain something like Auschwitz or any of the other terrors that happened in the mid 20th century? How do we explain that? Either maybe God's not good, or God's not all powerful, but it seems just to go against the idea that He could be both, and yet we experience this work of evil in this world. And theologians started making this turn, saying, well, maybe the Bible actually doesn't avoid the question of evil or violence or terror. And in fact, the Bible doesn't. It doesn't give this perfect idealistic image of the world and say, look what God did and look at what we should expect. It's all from the very beginning, basically. The second chapter and the third chapter especially, is you just have this like turn of life is good. And then hell breaks loose, and maybe even literally we can say that. And from there on until near the very end, we see life being full of complications and evil. And sometimes it's because people are doing bad things, and sometimes it's because they're doing good things and bad people want to stop them. And the Bible is full of these stories of evil happening. And sometimes God isn't stepping in, and yet that's the irony, right? We look at these stories and why isn't God stepping in? But then this is the Bible, which is the one that's supposed to be telling us what we need to know about who God is, and yet in the very narrative, it's telling us the things that are happening then that are often happening in our own life. Which is to say, it's not avoiding our question, or it's not trying to disguise. It's not, and yet we don't want to read those parts where Joseph was thrown in prison for 10 years for not sleeping with his boss's wife. We don't want to read those parts where prophets were beaten or killed when they were speaking the truth. We want to read the good part where Joseph is brought back and things are saved, and Daniel is the lion's den. He doesn't get eaten. And we like those stories, and we say, why doesn't God do that to us? But then we miss all those parts where Paul was beaten and shipwrecked and the rest, and he goes on to praise God, saying there's this work and mission of God that's in confrontation with the world. And it's not that evil suddenly stops, it's that God is doing a work, and while we may not always understand what that work is, we're impatient. We experience the darkness in the moment. We know that this experience isn't the end of the story. And so death isn't the end. There's this renewal of life. But death is ugly, right? It's brutal. And sometimes we just sit in this reality and don't know where to turn and say, where are you, God? And a number of theologians who were responding to that crisis of Auschwitz said, where was God in Auschwitz at the time of Auschwitz? He was in the concentration camps. Where was Jesus? He was being starved to death and beaten and thrown into a gas chamber, all the rest. And is that being too dramatic? No, because we look at what the cross was, and that was really the equivalent kind of experience of Jesus being dehumanized, which is what the Holocaust was trying to do, not just kill, but to dehumanize. And Jesus went through this similar process of dehumanization in the cross, and then whatever it means to die, pain, suffering, darkness, emptiness, prison, those things that people experience after death, or even some experience this before death. And so that's why there's suicides and this dismay and agony of just the life that it is, and people just don't know how to deal with it. And Jesus says, I'm with you. When we say Jesus goes to the dead, we say Jesus goes to the place of loneliness, of isolation, of hurt, pain, of dehumanization. And he goes there. And he sings the songs of lament. God, why have you forsaken me? Psalm 22, these psalms and these words that talk about being empty and dark. And so we know that God is our hope and God is our promise. But when we say, why is it that we say Jesus descended to the dead? Because when we say Jesus descended to the dead, we can sing songs of lament, knowing that Jesus is with us. Sing songs of truth, saying, this is the situation I'm in. Where are you, God? We can be honest and still have this hope that this isn't the end of the story. And I'm going to try something that I tried to end with last week and didn't work out as well, but I think it's going to hopefully work a little bit better tonight. We're going to open up with a lament that Amy, my wife, wrote. We'll see. She gets some royalties off of this, no doubt, based on clicks. Is that what it is? See if I can get over there.
Where is your justice? Where is your goodness? Where on the earth is your peace? Where is
Dissent gives us a space for lament, for crying out in honesty and openness, for God to hear us in our pain where we're at. And so often we want to protect God, like Peter wanting to protect Jesus from the temple guard. We want to protect God from our honesty or pain, and we say, no, we don't want this to happen, or we don't want to hear other people's, we want to protect God from other people's honesty and frustration. And there's a lot of interesting characters in this, doing a lot of interesting things, right? We like to keep things safe and avoid the characters in life or our own honesty or whatever, but that's why I think it's important to sit with this death, because if we don't have experience the death, if we don't experience the dropping in life, we don't really learn what it means to rise again. And so we miss out on this beautiful part of Jesus, but it just takes these seasons where of honesty. It's just about being honest. It's not about being fake. So much of religion, so much of Christianity tries to impose this fakeness, and yet that's not what it is at all. And there's this brutal honesty that I think is welcomed. I don't know about you, I'm just enjoying watching these birds, these ravens fly, right? They do that dive bomb thing. It didn't have to be this way. I mean, that's the thing with Jesus. It's the reality is we try to keep Jesus safe and God safe, and we try to, tone down some of the darkness, whether it's in our own experiences or what other people are saying, and we think maybe Jesus didn't really know what the effect of this was going to be, and he should have maybe done it some other way. We won't say that out loud, but this is the ludicrous thing, and he really could have. It didn't have to be this way. Jesus could have followed the fame and honor and glory through the structures of the time. He could have if he had just let himself play along a little bit better, he would have had this, a lot more authority and a lot more voice and a lot more influence, and he didn't do it. And that's really the very essence. We see the beginning of his ministry after the baptism, where he goes out into the wilderness and fasts for 40 days, so he's hungry, right? And he's tempted. He's tempted to eat, turn do some miracle just to eat, to, get fame from the crowds, to get himself saved, and to just prove himself using this ego kind of language or basic needs, this very human kind of temptation. He said no, and he turned back the temptations to the tempter. And the interesting thing, of course, is that both sides of that were using scripture, but one was using it right and one was using it wrong, and that's the challenge, right? We can't just say, here's the words of scripture, here's what we're doing. What does it mean to actually listen to the story of Jesus, to see what he did, and to trust that the method of Jesus, both in his own life and in how he works, isn't actually a mistake? I think that's a big challenge. That's a big challenge for me, if I can be a little honest. Over the last 5 years, there's been significant amount of frustration and uncertainty in my job situation. Higher academia is this place where there's just very few jobs and a lot of people doing a lot of work for uncertain. And again, I keep being thrust into this place where I'm like, I'm doing everything I can. I'm doing all I need to do. Top marks, all the rest in teaching and writing. And then I find out I don't have a job, or I find out something didn't go through, or it just again and again I wonder why is it that God led me here to have to endure that? There were so many times in my life where I prayed, God, your will be done, and I wanted to be faithful to that. And I keep thinking if I was faithful to that, then God should be faithful in giving things working out. And over the years, I've realized how to sit in the uncertainty a little bit better. I'm not there yet, but I'm getting there. How to sit in that uncertainty and have confidence that those prayers haven't been ignored, That if I'm in a situation of difficulty, it's not because God is absent, God isn't loving, or God isn't able. It's that this season I'm in somehow is being shaping or using, or I'm interacting with people I'm supposed to interact with. And to learn how to actually be in the moment of the thing rather than get overwhelmed with the moment, even if the moment's overwhelming. I mean, that's the hard truth. Sometimes the reality is that things are overwhelming. Somebody is rubbing against my door back there. I suspect one of the children. But instead of making things okay even for himself, he could have made things at least better for himself, right? But instead, by choosing death, by descending to the very depths, he not only gave up forms of godhood, this exalted experience that he deserves, but he also gave up forms of his humanity. So we say Jesus is fully man and fully God, and in experiencing the fullness of death, it seems like he lets go both. Now, this is kind of closing in on heresy, I know, but again, what is it that death is? What is death? Can God die? It's this shocking moment where our very narrative bumps up against what we say is true, and we're confronted with the idea that in engaging death and experiencing death, whatever death is, Jesus let his whole being fall into this whatever it is. What is hell? Sometimes we can say hell is this, we have the image of the fire and the big horned beast and the pitchforks and poking people and all the rest. As I'm talking, images of old Far Side scenes are coming to my mind of those versions of hell that Gary Larson said. He's back apparently though, so I haven't checked his website recently, but he has a website and is starting to post things, which is unheard of for the last 20 years or so. So there you go. There is hope for humanity. What is hell though? Oftentimes hell is not necessarily an experience all by itself, but often hell is the contrast. I've been in really nice places and I've been in really hard places, and sometimes if you've been in a hard place a while, you actually grow somewhat accustomed to it. But the distinction when you're in this ideal place and then you are thrown immediately into this very horrible place, the contrast tears us apart. We don't have, just like we're not very good about handling huge changes of temperature, so too we're not capable of handling huge changes of circumstances or experiences. And so for Jesus, who had ultimate power and ultimate authority and could heal and could bring people back to life, worshipped, honored, glorified, and then for him to experience the ultimate brokenness of death, is that not hell? So we say he descended to death or he descended to hell, but maybe we can say these are really saying the same thing. The experience of hell was the experience of the contrast of Jesus being who he is, going into death and losing all that reality. He emptied himself. He joined with those who are utterly dehumanized. He joined with those who are cast out and outcast. He didn't go and lead his army with all the popular people and the powerful people and, have this party down in hell. He just went where there was brokenness and hurt, and that's what we say continues. He went and joined those who were utterly dehumanized, those who had lost everything it means to be human. He was forsaken, even by God. How does that work? It's one of these complexities that we have the narrative for, but don't always know how to navigate theologically. But there we're left with. He experienced the brokenness and emptiness, and so it was with those who were broken and empty. Just like the thief on the cross, one insulted him and one supported him, and Jesus said to the one who was supporting him, "You're going to be with me." And so he was with you're going to be with me, but right now I'm with you on the cross. So this is what I think we see. By personalizing his teaching, by taking the weight on himself, by living out the obedience to the cross, not just to the edge where he could have used his power or authority to get himself off. He actually let the cross experience what everyone else was experiencing. So he committed his teaching to the judgment of his future. Can we trust Jesus? When Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the light, that I'm reaching out to the broken and the outcast, that those who are poor in spirit are blessed. How do we believe that stuff? Why should we believe that stuff? Who is this guy? Well, we see then this guy say, I believe this so much, I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to experience the cross, suffering, darkness, death. So what does that leave us? Ethics, eschatology, end times, past and future, humanity and divinity are forsaken with Jesus on the cross, because at this moment, all those stories, all these promises, all the religion that had going on came to this moment and says, is it true or is it not true? And if Jesus experiences death on the cross and we look at, well, he couldn't even save himself, we better go somewhere else and find the truth or find the hope, because this guy isn't going to help us. So this event, the event of the cross, the event of his death, is the very crossroads, literally, of determinative history. What do I mean by determinative history? Determinative history is the history we all experience. That's the history we're used to. The idea that something happened in the past that has shaped who we are. And that this trajectory we're on, the decisions of the past, the experiences of the past, the experiences now and our decisions now are going to shape who we are in the future. That's the river of time that we're caught in. And so many of us have made decisions over the course of our years where we look back, man, I shouldn't have made that decision, but now I'm stuck with the reality of it. Or a lot of us look back and say, well, that was a good decision. So we have these mixed experiences, but all of us put us on these trajectories. And many of us, all of us, have these stories too of decisions and events that go on farther than our own memory, farther than even written memory, that have somehow created this trajectory so that we didn't just jump into the river ourselves. We were born in this river of time that's taking us who knows where, but we're caught in its currents. We're bombarded by our own decisions, but also by the decisions of everyone around us and people of authority, or people, you go down the list, we're affected by their decisions. And so much so that we can say our whole history is determined. What option, what experience do we have? If we're poor and suffering, what hope is there for people who have been cast out or lost? They don't have the privileges of people who have been born with a lot of wealth or power. So what's hope for them? Is there and so you have this whole experience of determinative history seeming to set some people up right and some people up wrong, and most of us are caught in the middle of it. So that's one road we see at the cross. That's the road that put Jesus on the cross. But Jesus spoke of a different road. He spoke of a different way. He didn't experience the cross because he was a victim of Rome or a victim of the religious leaders or the victim of the zealots. He walked through the trial because his experience of history was actually inverted. He started with this experience of hope, of promise. Why? He trusted God. He trusted the promises of God. He trusted the wisdom of God. He was confident that history isn't determinative at all, but that God can break into our experience of history and bring transformation and bring renewal. That you can experience things beyond the final point of hope, which is what death is. In a determinative history, maybe someone could have saved Jesus when he was in the trial. That's what we say. That was the time for a breakout to happen, or even before, when they're trying to catch him, for Peter and all the disciples to pull out their swords and get away from the religious leaders. Could they have done it? They're very well possible. Then when Jesus was first put on the cross, it may have been more difficult, and maybe he would have had to have some angel help or something. But that would have been the time in which, before he had lost too much blood or the rest, we would have had this experience of God's salvation, because before it got too far. But we find Jesus saying, I'm letting this happen, and actually dying. He's dead. They put a spear in his side. They take him down from the cross. Well, maybe, just maybe, something could have happened, and this spark of life could have happened there. Maybe, and he would have risen triumphantly in front of the crowd that had just killed him, and that would have been a great, very dramatic moment. But no. They took him to a tomb. They wrapped him up in linen. They put him in the tomb on Friday night. And that was it. That's determinative history. So what's the next step? Jesus is born. Jesus lived. Jesus died. Well, that's the end of the story. Determinative history doesn't go beyond death. From a determinative history perspective, death is the end of a story. You don't say, what next? You say, who's next? This guy didn't work. But Jesus says, there's something more. He doesn't stop. So he brings this perspective into the worst possible experience. The idea that determination isn't actually determinative, but there's this eschatological history. That's a big, there's your vocabulary word for the day, eschatological. What does that mean? Well, one way of understanding that word is, say, end times, where we look at what is happening when Jesus returns, and that you have that whole study and sometimes have charts, and we'll probably get to that at some point, probably near the end of this Apostles' Creed study. But I like to look at it in a somewhat different way. Rather than just say end times, I like to say eschatology is really history viewed through God's perspective, and God is outside of time. So what does it mean to view reality from God's perspective that isn't A, B, then C, or then, now, and later? It's outside of the experience of time, and thus beyond our comprehension, but isn't limited to the experience of determination. So eschatological history is, what is reality as determined by God's presence and experience of this world? History doesn't limit God. The acts of people don't limit God. Powers in this world don't limit God. So God can enter into and bring something new at any given point. And so Jesus goes to the cross and goes to death, knowing, what is death? We see this in the letters of Paul, right? Death doesn't have a sting anymore. Well, it hurts. We feel the mourning because we're still experiencing time in its flow, but for God, he's saying death doesn't have its sting or pain because it's no longer the determining reality. Because Jesus, having gone into death, doesn't let death win. As I said last week, when Jesus joins those who are in death or in hell or in brokenness, he becomes companion to them in their suffering. But then they become companions to him in his future. You see that with the prisoner, the other man on the cross. Jesus was with him on the cross, but then he is going to be with Jesus in paradise. So this is the question, which has the final say? Determinative history. Life is what life is. You make a bad decision, you get caught in a lot of brokenness. You know what? You're lost. That's it. There's no hope. Should have made better decisions. Or if you see people or friends who make all sorts of bad decisions or do bad things, you're like, man, they had so much possibility, and now they just messed it up. But that's not the message of Jesus. The message of Jesus is that at any given moment, radical transformation is possible. So which has the final say? And that is the ultimate confrontation of the cross, not just with the Roman leaders, not just with the religious leaders, not just with the social zealots, but with death itself, that ultimate arbiter of someone's story, that moment at which it says the end and the book closes, and that's the story as is, no hope for other change. But Jesus says, is this not a fitting image? Who has the final say? Death seems death. You get eaten, you get thrown around, it's brutal, it's awful. Or flying. I didn't plan that. Does the future have say, or the past? And when we say does the future have the say, does God's future, does God's plan, does God's promise, that ultimate picture of reality that hasn't yet happened yet and so feels distant and unknown, does that have the ultimate say, or does our past have the ultimate say? Do other people's past have the ultimate say? Do other people's decisions have the ultimate say of who we are and our value? What say you? What's your experience of life right now? Are you in that place of flying, or are you feeling a lot more like that dead rat we saw earlier, squashed and broken and bloodied? So which history determines the identity of Jesus? That's what we're left with. And when we say Jesus dies, we're forced, at least in the Apostles' Creed, to sit there for a sentence, which isn't too long, but given how short the Apostles' Creed is, it's still the idea that we're forced to spend that time there is saying something. Which history determines who Jesus is? The determination of Rome or the determination of God? Which history determines who we are? The determination of our decisions, the determination of our society, the determination of our history. Going back, I took finally they had a 50% off sale. And so I've been thinking about this for quite a while, the Ancestry.com DNA test. So I've sort of had it in the back of my head. I'm curious. I have a history major, and I'm curious about stories, and I put together a genealogy a number of years ago and haven't worked on a lot since, but I got pretty thick back then. And so I finally took the DNA test, and it didn't tell me, it wasn't really surprising. You always hear those, man, I took the DNA test and it's so surprising. I was watching a show just the other day. It was this private detective show, and the person comes in and he wants to find his birth parents because he took a ancestry or some kind of DNA test, and it showed that he was 48% Native American, and his who he thought were his parents were not at all. And so he confronted them, and they told him he was adopted. And so that's the kind of thing where you think, oh, these big huge surprises. Well, it doesn't. That's not my story. So my parents, if you are watching, no surprises apparently. So I'm Northern European, English, like 47% English, and a little Norwegian and Irish and Scottish, and that's it. So my story seems to be connected to that part of Europe, but really my story isn't the DNA. My story is the fact that whoever were the Odins, and going back to all the various names that came into this, they were coming to the North America in the 1600s, and so as far back as I can trace, fifth great grandparents, and way farther back into the 1700s and earlier, they're all here in the United States. And so what is my story? Who am I? Well, I'm a Californian. You could go down the list of all these markers, and this genetic markers and biological markers and story markers, and all the decisions that were made decades and centuries ago that feed into who I am, and that put me in this seemingly box. And does that say who I am? Am I determined to be that person as just part of this flow? Or does Jesus invite me to someone that's part of my story, but that's not the whole of my story? I'm not destined for the kinds of brokenness that some in my family have had in the past. generations back. Nor am I destined to take on the identity of their riches or wealth or all the good things either. Some people are born with these huge honors, and some people are born in brokenness. And both ways can actually bring distortion. You can get broken in the experience of privilege and lost and fall into all sorts of traps that lead you away from your true self. This is why celebrities are so depressed and all the rest, because you think there's this, if you just had all this stuff and the stuff doesn't matter. We get caught in these forms of being that aren't us. So what determines our identity? Determinative history or eschatological history? Jesus threw himself completely and totally into this eschatological history, so much so that he is really willing to risk his very identity. Everything he said came into the moment. His death gives a very real example to his teaching. Does Jesus trust his teaching? Yes. And also for Christian theology in general. His death says this isn't a nice religious philosophy that should help guide us in some challenging spiritual parts of our life so that we have a well-packaged metaphysics or understanding of the afterlife while we can continue to live the rest of the way we want. The death of Jesus is saying it's all or nothing. This experience of ultimate loss either stays as loss in determinative history or moves into ultimate gain. Was Jesus right? And so that unites his proposal for how we are to live. If Jesus is right, then everything he taught we need to listen to. This is reality. This is how humanity was made to be. And it also forms us in what we are to expect. Should we be scared of brokenness? Should we see opposition or discouragement as somehow a marker that God isn't capable or God isn't loving? We've been there. How are we to live, and what are we to expect? If Jesus is right, we know that Jesus enters into the darkness and suffering and gets it and sits with us, but he doesn't leave us there. So what are we to expect? So the cross, this is a challenge because, again, as I said last week, the cross seems to say that Jesus is wrong, that we shouldn't trust how he said to live, and we shouldn't expect what he said to expect, because he trusted his teachings and it got him on the cross, and what he expected to have, the kingdom, and he got a tomb, right? It seemed to be not validated. The message was rejected. It seemed to be this moment in which the message was rejected. Jesus was wrong. Enemies and followers actually had to not only have this moment where there was doubt, but they actually had to sit with the reality. His enemies had to say, we're right. He's wrong. And his followers had to say, I don't know that guy. I don't know what we were thinking. How did we get caught in this mess? So they were all trying to scramble and get away. They had to sit with this, that Jesus seemed to be wrong. Now let's go on and live the way we're supposed to live, because that's the way that makes sense. So the experience of the cross was the experience of God encountering ultimate rejection. Ultimate rejection, death. Jesus wasn't saved either. Jesus wasn't given a reprieve. Jesus wasn't saved the beating and the battering and worse, from what I know about. I've heard about what the victims of crucifixion encountered. The Bible is very tame. The ultimate rejection. Even Jesus wasn't saved. And not only the physical rejection, but the experience of being distant from God, absent for God, God being silent in this moment. decisively because he didn't intercede when Jesus seemed to need it the most. The experience of the cross was God confronts suffering by entering into it. So why does evil happen? We're not told. But we know that God confronts it, just like he confronted the religious leaders, just like he confronted Rome, just like he confronted the zealots. He confronts suffering. He doesn't avoid it. He doesn't dismiss it. He doesn't say suffering is all there is, or that suffering doesn't exist, to speak words of faith. He enters into the fullness of what it means to suffer. And no explanation is given necessarily for why. The cross addresses it, the idea of suffering. No explanation is given for the problem of evil and suffering. The cross addresses it by saying, Jesus joins us. Where is God in the suffering? Right here. Now, how is that a help? Right? That's the big question. Why is that helpful? Yeah, God, thanks for being with me, but I'd rather not be here. But this is where we need to be careful not to stop in our experience of time or determinative history. The cross addresses it by saying Jesus joins us with our suffering. The cross then transforms the questions themselves. Why is God allowing this? That's the key question, the problem of suffering. Why is God allowing this? How can I believe in this God? Become something different. Where is God at work? Why does God allow this? Why is it that I haven't had these kind of settled jobs that everyone else seems to get? Why is this? Why are other people doing this? Why is God allowing this kind of uncertainty to continue? And it becomes this for me. Where is God? Here I am. God's future, God promised. So where is God at work? And how can I highlight and live into this work? How can I live into the hope so that rather than being crushed by the uncertainty, I can be someone who speaks words of faith to others who are in a similar place of uncertainty? So not only does the uncertainty become to have meaning, but it actually ends up having power, because whenever you have everything good and great going for you, people who are suffering don't necessarily want to listen to you, right? But if you're saying, I'm with you, this sucks, let's keep walking. Let's keep walking. Where's God working? Let's do this work. What can I do to make the most of this moment? And seek and empower and celebrate the fact that God is working in the people around me, in the situations around me, and all sorts of things, training me, but also using me. Where is God at work? Why did this happen? Man, sometimes we have a question, I shouldn't have done that, or I can't believe these people made that decision, and God, and they're feeling all this success, and we get all this judgment. Why does this happen? What did I do, or could I have done? Becomes, what shall I do? Not why did it happen, and become passive and a victim to it. Who shall I be? Maybe even is a better way of saying that. How can I be faithful? Knowing that God is not absent, knowing that God is not done with the story, how can I be faithful in this season of uncertainty so that when God brings an answer, I can look back and say, I was faithful, even when I didn't know. It's easy to be faithful when you see the answer on the other side. It's easy to trust that you're going to be financially okay, even if you have a low paycheck now, if you know you're going to get $1 million inheritance next year. Now, you might have to, struggle a little bit, but you'll say, I'll be okay. But when you don't know if there's even going to be a paycheck next year. And I'm somewhat in that situation, given that I have a year contract. I don't know what I'm doing after June. But I'm confident. So what shall I do in this moment to be faithful to who I am called to be now? And it's not that I'm dismissing or ignoring the why this happens. That question becomes irrelevant. That's not the question that God is having me ask. I may never know this. But what he's asking me to do is be faithful and obedient in this. Where is God at work? Look around. Where is God at work? And what shall I do? Now, does that solve the problem of evil and suffering? Why? No. And let's be honest here, it doesn't. That's a very difficult question. But what it does is it transforms it. It transforms the problem of evil and suffering to one of promise and hope. Because even though there is and will be evil and suffering, am I going to be someone who succumbs to that and lets that overwhelm me and define me? Or am I, like Jesus, going to enter into that, being a person of promise and hope, and see the others who are around me and say, here's my hand, let's keep walking together? Am I going to be the spy who goes into the land and says, these people are too big, it's too overwhelming, let's just give up and crawl and die? Or am I going to be the one who says, these people are big and it's overwhelming, it's impossible, but God is bigger. Let's do this. And the moment of death that Jesus enters into is this moment of stopping where everything else is stripped away. There is no reason to believe in Jesus except trusting. There's no sign, there's no symbol, there's no guarantee. What do? What are we left with? Do we trust? And that's a decision whether we are a new Christian, whether we are an experienced Christian, whether we are a Christian who barely knows the difference between Old and New Testament, or a Christian who can speak all the different languages and it's decades of theological study. We're all left with the same question. In a moment of complete emptiness, do we trust? That's the moment of death we all come to. We forsake ourselves. We forsake our determinative history, whether it's this real positive thing or this real negative thing. We say, that doesn't define us. We forsake all forms of oppression, ways in which we're trying to fight and compete and control and dominate so that we can assert our identity for its own sake, so that we may not be able to rise up here, but at least we won't be at the bottom of the pile in our context. Those are ways in which we're trying to establish our own determinative self over and against other people, experiencing hell that drives us forward, but also causing hell for others. The moment of death, spiritual death, if not real death, that Jesus leads us into, is saying, doesn't matter. I'm going to let go even trying to prove myself. Are we willing to trust that? It's easy to die, right? Just that happens. It'll happen to all of us. It's much less easy to let the emptiness and forsakenness reach us now, so that we actually stop and say, do I believe? Do I believe for the sake of God, who promised identity and who is the only one who can give me ultimate meaning? Do I stop and say, all these other things aren't giving me meaning? Now, I may be called to continue to do them, but they're not giving me meaning. My job, if I get caught up in my identity being a professor of theology and all the other degrees and titles before and after my name and ordained and all those things that mark me as someone who knows things of God and religion, if I make that my identity, then if I lose my job, or if I don't get honored, or my book doesn't sell, or is priced at $130, so cuts me off at the knees from the very beginning, do I say, oh, that was my hope of getting out of this pit I feel like I'm in? Or do I say, how can I continue to walk? So for the sake of God, do I say, I'm going to hold everything loose and be faithful, no matter what the response is? Am I going to be faithful to doing this? Maybe there's 5 people watching now, maybe 6. Does it make a difference? No, because being faithful in doing this, whether there's 5 or 500, in the community, in listening, in hearing the interests and concerns and imagination of others, we had a conversation which led to this happening, and here we are. It doesn't depend on response. It depends on letting it be who God is, and I can be more faithful in being on time and in being attentive and having, the more I do, I think there's this help. There's things I can do, but at the end of the day, what does it mean to be faithful, even when no one's watching? This openness, this place of like, whatever. Do I have genuine peace? Is really a place of negation, because there's this really big reality that it won't matter. It won't matter. Like, what's the point of working? I'm getting that this week, right? When you don't know what your job's future is, and it's not based on how well you do, but on a lot of other factors, and you're like, what's the point? And you can let that lead you into despair, or you can actually experience a kind of negation. It actually doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I lose my job, because God is still good. Do I believe that? Having been in this process now for a number of years, every year going into spring, I don't know, I'll say that I'm learning this, and I'm genuinely closer to that now. Can I be open to the negation without resolution? With my whole being, all the things I've worked for, all the money I've spent, all the decisions I've made for the last 20 years. That's the thing. That's the problem I'm in, because when I look, I have a degree in theology and teaching and the rest. And when I say, am I able to keep a job? I look back and go, man, I should have made different decisions that got me into a job that paid well, right? Like, learn coding, or there's like historically low unemployment, and yet I pick one of the few fields in which has overwhelmingly high unemployment. That's a bad decision, right? So I look back and say, at what point do I need to make that turn? And I keep going back farther and farther back, and I look back to say, either God really has led me and I've listened, or every decision I've made since I was 17 is wrong. Well, that can be crushing, because I made decisions when I was 17 to go to a Christian college in a far too far away, which was far too expensive, to study far too much not profitable studies, when I should have stayed closer in Southern California, where the sun is wonderful and I had a great community and church. And what was I thinking? I was thinking I was following God. Why did I go to seminary instead of law school? Why did I take 6 years off after seminary to go live in the mountains and not have a steady paycheck or this momentum? And what am I doing now? Holding on to teaching in an uncertain field. All the decisions. Feeling that negation. It's either all wrong or all right. And I'm coming to you right now without it being resolved. I don't know. So who am I? So it's a risk. And I'm living this risk, because this isn't just something I'm teaching. When I first taught these ideas back when I finished my PhD, I had this dynamic sense of momentum and progress, and then discouragement and discouragement kept happening, even though I was being praised and honored in all sorts of directions, but it was decisions outside my choice. I was just reading the other day that emotional health is dependent on an experience of life in which your conscious decisions make a difference in your goals for success. You can deal with frustration and loss if you know you've made decisions that sort of led you there. It's like, but if you know you've made decisions that are good and helpful and right, and it still leads to loss, it's emotionally challenging. It's emptying. It's destructive. Despair enters in. And yet here I am. Not only not having run away from this path, but dug in even more deeply, because what I'm teaching here, that the death of Jesus is not the end, but that there is a hope and promise that brings us out of death into life, is the very risk I'm living out. Not to the point of ultimate death, but essentially my whole professional identity is here. Do I trust God? Do I sit with Jesus in the darkness and emptiness and despair and frustration and the unknowing and being fired or not being hired or all the rest? Do I trust God, or do I trust myself? Now, what does it mean to trust myself? Well, there's a lot of things I could do to enter into the frenzy. I could be always traveling. I could wear myself down. I could spend all my time trying to hobnob and not be near family and not rest and be exhausted. And there are people I know who do that, and they find a version of success. But not only am I not doing that, I'm saying, what is the way of peace in the moment, and willing just to stop and say, I need a Sabbath. because it's not up to me. I'm going to put my future in God's hands. It's a risk. And it's a risk that, like that Saturday experience with Jesus, isn't yet resolved. Talk to me in a year, see if I'm right. But I'm taking that risk. We see Psalm 22, 19 through 23, and I'm going to go ahead and read that. I have my usual Bible, kept it handy at the desk this time. Psalm 22, 19 through 23 says this, having talked, interestingly, in a way that echoes Jesus' experience on the cross, despair and brokenness and emptiness and pain. But then it makes us turn in verse 19. But you, Lord, don't be far away. You are my strength. Come quick and help me. Deliver me from the sword. Deliver my life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion, from the horns of the wild oxen. You have answered me. I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. I will praise you in the very center of the congregation. All of you who revere the Lord, praise him. All of you who are Jacob's descendants, honor him. All of you who are all Israel's offspring, stand in awe of him. It's this proclamation of hope in the midst of the suffering. Not dismissing the reality of the suffering. The suffering is what it is. But it's saying, there's more to the story. Don't stop at verse 18. And yet so many of us are stuck at verse 18 saying, where's God? Don't stop at verse 18. Because only in Christ overcoming death for us, only in Christ confronting death and joining us in our experience of death, whether real death or the metaphorical kinds of death of emptiness and despair and being outcast and all the rest, do we have hope? Is it possible? This is me just saying this. Everything that Christianity orients around this. Only in Christ overcoming death for us can we overcome death with God. So where's the hope in suffering? It's not that somehow the suffering is erased. It's that the suffering isn't the end of the story. There's more to the story. Up next, in next week's episode, right? Kids today don't understand the pain we had to go through back when we had big cliffhangers, and we have to wait at least a week to see how it's resolved. Now they could just, they don't even have to click a button. Netflix just goes right to the next one. Our core sacraments remind us of baptism. These sacraments are meant for something. We were buried with him through baptism into death. We experienced death. Just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may live a life. The symbol of baptism is a symbol that determinative history doesn't control us, but that we can enter into death, and Jesus promises us life. That's the journey. In the experience of death, do we commit ourselves to Jesus' future, or do we say, this guy didn't know what he was doing? We're left with that decision. And then we do it regularly. Communion, 1 Corinthians 11:17. We remember his death for us so that we are invited into this new life. These are personal. This is something saying to us, but it's also social. It's saying something to those around us. So that no, it's not just us in isolation, me and Jesus. It's saying that Jesus isn't just the Lord of my own personal spiritual life. It's everything or nothing. So what is the promise of Christ? So we're confronted again with the questions of the cross in this. These are the questions, however you want to answer these, and different religions do it, and people who say they're not religious do it. They just change the language somehow. Who speaks for God? If God doesn't exist, well, then they say nobody. But everyone has answers to these. We're confronted. Who speaks for God? Who speaks for this world? Who speaks for the people? We're left with this answer. What's our answer? Everyone answers this. So how we orient our answers to this determines who we're going to be. How we're going to live this life. What matters? What does it mean to be human? What are we supposed to do in this world? So where do we have hope for the future? Where's our risk? There are two sides then. What Christianity says is there's two sides. There's not like this, feet in two worlds thing. There's the people who were with Jesus and then one against Jesus. And there's a lot of people in Christianity, and I'm going to be a little bit more critical against Christianity now, because there's a lot of people who want to have that two sides. They want to say, I'm with Jesus, but I also want to get all the trappings of the rest. So you got this mixed message, and that doesn't happen. Either Jesus was right, and the world fits with his whole teaching. Everything he taught, all the life and the purpose and how we're supposed to respond to others and how we're supposed to deal with money and power and all the rest, either that is right or it's wrong. There's no moral teaching of Jesus that you can sort of pick and choose. Jesus isn't a buffet. Here's the dish. So how do we know? How do we know whether he's right? That's the interesting question. I think why Twitch, right? Why Twitch? But I think this is the question that makes video games so fun. I love role-playing games. I do, and sometimes I keep saying this. I'm playing the game Prey now when I get a spare moment, which is this story of being caught in this space station, and it's a little more of a linear game than I'm usually used to. More of a but there's a lot of decisions you make. Should I go off and save this person? But the more fun ones for me are the kinds of decisions like the Witcher game, or Skyrim, or all those where you actually have these very moral decisions of how you're going to respond, and that changes the story all the way back around. And there's a certain way we want to hedge it, right? I'll admit to this. Sometimes when I'm faced with one of those big questions where there's not like this morally right or morally wrong question, but it's like we will go this way or that way. Sometimes I'll look up online to see what happens if I make decisions, and I'll choose the one that I like better. My typical way of doing role-playing games, it's not really a confession because it probably makes me look consistent, is that I try to actually make the decisions I would make if I were actually in this situation. I'm a horrible actor, so I actually try to be who I am and like what would be like if I actually was faced with this thing. But sometimes there are these questions, I don't know what I do, and we're like that in life. I don't know what will happen if I do this or if I don't do that, and so I sometimes like to see, because life is full of uncertainty. And that's what we're left with here. How do we know? No one can tell us. We're left for this crisis of the moment of Jesus dead. And a lot of people say, I don't believe that. And a lot of people say, I do believe that. How do we know? You got to take a risk. It's a risk. And people try to soften faith and soften spirituality or hedge their bets and somehow get this. But it's a risk. You just have to go with it and see what happens. Could I be wrong? Yes. I don't think so. I spent a lot of time digging into this. So what do we do? So how do we know? We don't. We take a leap saying, from everything we know, this is the leap I'm going to take. And there's a lot of things leading us to that direction, and we're going to continue to talk about them more. I think that's what church is supposed to do, is be these people who, these shared testimonies reinforce the fact that we're on the right path and encourage us to keep going, because when you don't know where the end of the story is, it's helpful to have other people who are coming along. But then what do we do with it? What do we do? What do we do now? And which way do we go? A or B? Put him on the cross, join him on the cross. The way the world says, always pick A. Always be the person who puts other people on the cross. Never be the person who gets put on the cross, because that's the painful way. I mean, he might not be guilty, but what's having a bit of a guilt about making the wrong decision is much better than being horribly suffering and being horribly disfigured and dying, right? There's like a little guilt, horrible suffering. Which way do we go? Do we assert our identity, or do we say, I'm going to trust this Jesus guy? So it really is this choosing a side. And this is where the death thing comes. It just keeps hitting us. And I'm spending a lot of time saying this because it just keeps hitting us. Because again, there's a lot of trying to hedge the bets, whether in Christianity or outside. We're like, and there's just not that. It's either it's all in or all out. If we try to mix it, we're going to get pulled direction. At some point, we're going to experience it. It's dangerous because it involves the dominant identifying with the forsaken. It involves me saying I have a huge amount of education. I think, a smart guy. I'm not horrible in a lot of ways. I could have made decisions that use my intelligence and will to make a lot more money. I could still do that. There's a lot of ways of success and power. Or do I say, rather than spending my time to hobnob with people who can really help me out professionally or the rest, I say, I'm going to be on Twitch and see who's here and what will happen, right? It's dangerous. I'm taking the risk because I'm saying Jesus gives me identity, and I'm tired of trying to fight for myself, because I'm going to trust that there's this new work, and I'm going to be where Jesus is, and Jesus is with people who need help. Do we help? Do we include ourselves among the God-forsaken and the strangers in order to participate with Christ? Where's Christ to be found, and how can I be there? I didn't quite move all this over. In being with Christ, we find justification, and I'll step down, and liberation. In being identified with Christ, we find justification. What is justification? It's a very religious sounding word, right? It's this very we are made right with God, and we use all this kind of, we start talking in a lower voice and very, I should put a collar on. What is justification? It really is saying, in an ultimate sense, you're okay. You're fine. It's all right. Eternally. It's okay. It's okay. You're fine. Cut out all the religious language. What would it mean for you to have a sense in your inner being, all the chaos is gone, all the self-doubt is gone, all those questions about the past and your own hopes and dreams and discouragement, and just hear someone say, you're fine. It's all right. Things are going to be okay. Yeah, things you messed up, but it's fine. And what does liberation mean? Liberation means it's fine. And things are getting better. You're not committed to the decisions you made in the past. You're not committed to the decisions other people made for you in the past. You're not limited to the brokenness in the world, or whoever is elected or whoever loses. You're not committed to that stuff. We have hope that we can actually live a life of hope and freedom and peace and invite other people with us. In being identified with Christ, we're identifying with his future. Is Jesus right? Jesus says his is the way, and his is a way of light and truth and hope. And if you join with Jesus, we say, you're okay. And you can be free. What does that mean? We'll get to that next week as we press on. All right. Thank you very much for hanging out with me. I get to talking, and sometimes I just have a lot to say. So, have a great week.